Hello, students. This is Professor Gore, and this is part three of the Capitalism and Labor recorded lecture. And so, the first two parts, we talked about the industrial, tremendous economic growth with inventions and big captains of industry and manufacturing output and the importance of railroads and vertical and horizontal integration. So, this third part, we're going to talk about the labor who was actually working in these factories during this time, as well as the development of labor unions. So at the end of part two, we talked about kind of the pros and cons of capitalism and this economic growth at this time. The pros pretty much outweigh the cons, but one of the things that you'll see as a negative side of this tremendous growth is going to be the effect on labor and so forth. So three things to always remember with labor unions. They're going to be pushed for a variety of issues, but these three things you can always bet are going to be pushed for: better pay, better hours, better working conditions. So better pay, better hours, better working conditions makes it easy to remember. All right, let's talk about who was working in the South. So in U.S. History 1, during the Reconstruction time period, recorded lecture, I told well, if you didn't take me for U.S. History 1, you didn't hear it, but if you did and you listened to it, then it talked about the reason why textile mills came to the South. So the South was broke and poor after the American Civil War. Textile mills, their two greatest costs were labor and the cotton. And so cotton prices kind of plummeted during the war and after, but labor costs kind of went up. And so because Southerners were poor, they moved a lot of their textile mills to the South because they could hire cheap white and black workers. Okay. And also the Reconstruction government's push for industry coming to the South. That particularly the textile mills came to the Carolinas and Georgia. These textile mills has much as 40% lower labor costs in 1897 than New England mills. These mills hired whole families with young female workers making up at least half the labor force in the South. In the 1880s, a quarter of all Southern textile workers were under the age of 15. So a lot of child laborers were hired, not just in textile mills, a lot of industry. In the villages surrounded the mills, whites built close-knit supportive communities that excluded blacks. Okay, so you see that segregated South take place. And we'll cover that in another recorded lecture, but really emphasizing that in their Reconstruction recorded lecture during U.S. History 1. James Buchanan Duke became a robber baron when he developed the first rolled cigarettes, but would only hire white women to work. Even though certain industries, now one thing I mentioned about James Buchanan Duke, not only would he just hire women, he also hired only white women. So he was prejudiced based on your gender and your race. But he had made very successful, made a lot of money from the rolled cigarette industry. Even though certain industries were discriminatory in hiring, other industries such as logging and iron industry were not. So if you were black, you could get a job just fine in the logging and iron industries in the South. Some blacks did leave the South, with about 80,000 leaving between 1870 and 1890, and around 200,000 between 1890 and 1910. But the vast majority of African Americans that leave the South are going to do so during World War I and the years right after, particularly in the Roaring '20s, because of job opportunities and to escape segregation. And then secondly, during and right after World War II. It's called the Great Migrations in American history. So that is significant. So here's James Buchanan Duke. Now, immigrant workers, you have to understand this about the labor topic to understand what is happening, because there were so many, thousands upon thousands of immigrants coming. They were desperate to get a foothold in the United States, and so these new immigrants would accept lower wages because they were desperate to get a job. Native-born Americans wouldn't accept those wages. So on the other side of that, native-born Americans felt very much threatened about losing their job to these immigrants. They really worried about that. And so that's why the labor unions were so anti-immigrants, because of job competition. You have to understand the causes of that tension, is they felt threatened and so forth. And that's why that they were anti-immigrants and so forth. Now, it doesn't justify the discrimination and some of the persecution some of the immigrants faced and so forth. So before the Civil War, most of the immigrants came from, of course, England was the biggest source of immigration. Scandinavia, Germany and Ireland were the two biggest, particularly in the 1840s and 1850s. During the Gilded Age, okay, so between the Civil War and the 1890s, it was mostly Central Europeans and Northern and Western Europeans. So like Germans and um, Scandinavians and English and Irish were still coming. Also, Spanish and Portuguese were coming to the eastern seaboard, and Polish. But by the turn of the century, it becomes more from Southern and Eastern Europe. Okay, places that made up Austro-Hungarian Empire, Russia, Italy, the Balkans. This is where you have so many Italians and Greeks coming, so many Russians, particularly Russian Jews, escaping the religious pogroms that were taking place. You know, Bulgarians, Romanians. At one point, there were more Italians living in New York than there were in Florence, which is nothing but Italians. And so you have Serbians and other people from the Balkans that were coming, Croats, all these different Slavic speaking groups and so forth. So, and I can't, you know, a lot of Polish go to the Midwest, particularly in Chicago area. And still to this day, a lot of people that live in Chicago have a variation of a Polish last name, tracing its immigration heritage and so forth. And so you see this played out, and immigration is going to be a very, very, very important thing throughout American history, and it's one thing that will always be on quizzes and tests. Okay. Now we talked about the Irish coming in U.S. History 1 due to the potato famine and so forth. And one of the things we'll kind of talk about where these people end up working. The Welsh labored. This is southern part of England. That's where Welsh people were from. Labored as tin plate workers. The English as miners. The Germans as machinists and traditional artisans like bakers and carpenters, etc. The Belgians worked a lot in glass factories. The Scandinavians were seamen, might be working in the merchant marine, also on Great Lakes boats. A lot of the Scandinavians got involved in the logging industry up in the northern Midwest. Industrial tycoons, robber barons, as they were called, pushed to prevent immigration restriction to make sure they were getting that cheap source of labor. As immigrants shifted from northern Western Europe to southern Eastern Europe, heavy and low-paying work became the dominant jobs in industry. And so these heavy jobs that was low-skilled helped drive down the pay, and really a lot of not just native-born Americans, but other immigrants felt threatened by these Southern Eastern Europeans because they were just accepting such crappy wages because they were escaping such bad economic conditions in their home countries. Immigrants followed family members or fellow villagers already in the United States for lodging and to find work. High degree of ethnic clustering resulted, even within a single industry. Ethnic neighborhoods sprung up in industrial cities as well, and many immigrants became birds of passage who worked and saved money and then returned home. About 25%, they think. In fact, some historians estimate it could be as high as 50%, came, worked for a little bit, and then went back home. We see this today with a lot of migrant workers. They'll come work, they'll send the cash they're making back through Western Union or some other method, and then they'll return home because they can make so much more with wages here in the United States. Now let's look about talking about worker women at this time. Actually, before I get to that, I want to address ethnic clustering. I do cover this in the Growth of Cities recorded lecture, but it's natural when an immigrant group comes to an area that they don't speak the language, they don't practice some of the same cultural practices, to naturally want to settle around each other. And so what you end up happening is what's called ethnic ghettos. The term ghetto changes throughout American history. Now it's used to kind of mean a rundown, poor neighborhood with maybe high crime. But back then, really what a ghetto is just a neighborhood made up of a particular ethnicity. Okay, so you could have a Puerto Rican ghetto in New York, an Irish ghetto in Boston. You could have an Italian ghetto in Brooklyn or somewhere. I mean, but it was just basically an ethnic clustering. I mean, you had neighborhoods that were made up of Russians where they had Yiddish newspapers. They were Russian Jews. You had German neighborhoods that had German newspapers. You had entertainment, theatrical plays in that language that the people spoke. And so they were naturally clustered around others that were just like them. Okay. Now, working women in the family economy, with over 4 million working women for wages around 1900, they made up about a quarter of the non-farm labor force and played a vital part in the industrial economy. So what type of women usually worked? Well, typically they were not married. Okay, that made up the largest. And if they were primarily immigrants. Okay, now also African Americans as well in the South, but still, the even majority of them stayed home. Okay. And so the common cultural thought was that women were not supposed to work outside the home. Those who were the poorest had to, and that's why you would see that. Okay. So, for instance, among the white population, only about 5% worked. If you had a recent immigrant population, say from Greece or Italy or Bulgaria, you would have a higher percentage of work, especially if they were recent. Okay. So where do they work? They worked domestic servants. They were house cleaners. They did laundry service. A lot of female white collar jobs like secretarial work. As telephones developed, originally they hired young boys, but then the boys started using profanity as the operators. So then they started hiring women to be the operators for telephone companies. Now back then, the earliest telephones, you would call the operator, and then you would tell them who you wanted to speak with, and they would connect your line to whoever you were trying to call. So you always had to speak to the operator. Okay. Also, they worked industrial jobs. Okay. And now, on average, they were paid about $3 less than men. Okay. And one out of every five children under the age of 16 worked around 1900. Now, eventually, you're going to have some anti-child labor laws passed. We'll cover that during the Progressive era. And then eventually, that anti-child labor law gets declared unconstitutional, but state laws get passed at the state level, and that prevents child labor from happening. All right. So much of the industrial work was very monotonous, which if you took U.S. History 1, we talked about the increased alcohol consumption, which one of the reasons why the temperance movement pushed for that, because those that could least afford the alcohol were the ones that are buying it in highest volume. Different crafts developed their own slang words. Some industrial jobs were paid on how much they produce instead of by the hour or day or week. This allowed workers to feel a sense of freedom, but not everybody had that arrangement. Some factories, such as in Lowell, Massachusetts, required workers to be there working when the bell rang, locked in, and not quit until the bell sounded at the end of the day. Wow. No lunch break, no 10-minute break. Skilled laborers, however, could often hire their own helpers, supervise their work, and pay them from their own earnings. Dispersal of authority was characteristics of a 19th century industry. The aristocracy of the workers, the craftsmen inside contractors and foremen, enjoyed a high degree of autonomy. So basically, if you were a skilled laborer, you had greater autonomy, greater control of your wages, greater control of your working hours. If you were unskilled, forget about it. Okay. Still, any worker who paid his helpers from his own pocket might be tempted to exploit them, and foremen in Pittsburgh were notorious for driving their gangs mercilessly. All right. Technology eventually decreased the need for skilled laborers and instead brought more unskilled jobs where workers were paid even less. So as more and more machines get introduced, it leads to a same old monotonous job over and over. Now, let me compare that to today. My parents got to tour the largest Toyota plant in the U.S. It's in Kentucky, and it's changed a lot in labor. This is complete opposite from what we had back then. But each department area that you're working, they do various jobs. You do that job for 2-hour shifts, and then you switch. So you're not doing the same job for 8 to 10 hours a day. The manager person over you knows how to do each of those jobs. So in your department, you know how to do each of those. So when you go on vacation for a week, your manager just fills in for you. Okay. And so forth. They have their own cafeteria, so you eat there. If you're sick, you still come to work because they have their own doctors there. And then if you're still sick within 4 hours, they send you home. Man, we've changed a lot in workers' control and so forth from this day and age. Now, one of the reasons why you see these unskilled same jobs over and over and over is a guy named Frederick W. Taylor came up with the scientific management of work. And really, the reason why our school system, where we have the summers off and we have rows of desks, of course now they're starting to do like small group clusterings and so forth. They've been doing that for years now in the classroom, but these little pods or whatever as they call them, but the bells for class or whatever, that was actually developed in the Industrial Revolution to be efficient in the school setting. But anyway, but as machinery and so forth increased, it led to more low-skilled, industrial jobs. And because they produced these long runs of a single item, these machine tools became more specialized. They became machines set up to do the same job over and over without the need for skilled operatives. Anyway, the idea took hold that focusing on workers, getting them to work harder and more efficiently might itself be a way to reduce the cost of production. And so Frederick W. Taylor figured out a way to get the most out of your workers. Okay. So the result of that is you're going to have labor conflicts because they feel powerless, and they're going to start bargaining collectively with labor unions. Okay. Workers also could be paid at a differential rate. That is a certain amount if they met the stopwatch standard, or a higher rate for additional output. Taylor's method eventually drove division between workers and owners. All right, so let's talk about the very, very important labor movement. It's always on tests, always on the AP exam, always on quizzes, and so forth. So industrialization, one of the effects is it does form labor unions. Okay, you never had labor unions and so forth before the Industrial Revolution. While European movements embraced some variant of politically engaged socialism, American unionists rejected politics and emphasized collective bargaining with employees. By 1872, there were several hundred thousand organized workers in 32 national unions. The National Labor Union, organized in 1866, had about 600,000 members, but only lasted 6 years. And one of the things, it excluded the Chinese and women and blacks, so it was discriminatory. There was also a black labor union called the Colored National Labor Union, formed to combat this prejudice. And then the Knights of Labor started in 1869 and sought to include all workers, both skilled and unskilled. So one of the things about this division of labor and Frederick W. Taylor's kind of scientific method for industrialization, it led to very much impersonalization. At the end of the part 2 of this topic recorded lecture, I shared a quote from Teddy Roosevelt that was spot on about this time. And so if you were in an unskilled job, workers were easy to replace. If you didn't like it and complain, well, then they could just hire the next immigrant off the boat to fill your job. They could be trained in just a matter of a couple of hours and could run the machine. So that's going to happen. And also, as the progressive era develops, you're going to see that states began passing child labor laws, so try to prevent laborers that were under the age of 16 or 14 or whatever it is. Now, one of the things we'll cover the populist movement, Guild Age politics, and so forth. So I'm going to hold off on the populist movement right now. So you look at two different worlds. You've got a middle class family on the left, actually an upper middle class family. Notice how nicer they're dressed. They have time to play chess. Mom is looking on. You look at on the image on the right, they're shucking peas, not only for work to try to feed themselves, and the poor girl on the right is trying to sneak some peas in her mouth without her mother seeing. And so you look at 1861, there were 3 millionaires. By 1900, there were 3,800. And also by 1900, 90% of the wealth in the United States was controlled by 10% of the population. So it's the greatest division of wealth in the Gilded Age in American history. Now, the Progressive Era and then later time periods, particularly that post-World War II boom, is going to curtail a lot of that. But anyway, you do have the greatest division in wealth in American history. So here's our definition. So if you can print these couple slides out for just terms to study. Okay, what a labor strike is, what a labor union is. A boycott is where you refuse to buy the goods made by the company. So if you boycotted Walmart, or you boycotted Target, or you boycotted Kroger, or you boycotted Rubbermaid, or you boycotted Ford Motor Company, whatever it may be. One of the things that labor unions hated is what's called scab workers. And so let's say you went on strike, the industrial owner decided, you know what, I'm going to hire a new group of immigrants, or they might, in the Great Migrations, hire African Americans. Labor unions called them scab workers. It's just covering up the wound. And so that's one reason why immigrants get attacked, because they're hired as scab workers. It undercuts the labor strike. Okay. Now, one of the things that started happening is unions started making it, particularly if you were in management position, you were a union, that they would only hire people that joined the union. There's a lot of industries in a lot of states today that will only hire you if you join the union, and you have to pay union dues every year. On the flip side, business owners would be like, screw that, and they would blacklist or blackball anybody that joined the union and keep them from working. So you had closed shop on one end, blacklisted on the other. Then collective bargaining is just you negotiate as a group. Okay, labor unions typically have labor union representatives that negotiate for them. And then what was called a yellow dog contract. Now, the term yellow back then, we don't use the term now to mean this, but if somebody called you yellow, or you're yellow, it's because you were a coward. Okay, so if those who signed a contract to agree to not join a union, and if they join, they could be legally fired, labor unions called that a yellow dog contract. You're a coward for signing that. You need to stand up to the employer and be a member of a union. Okay. Also, a lockout is where, to combat a labor strike, a business owner would be like, you know what? All right, fine. You want to work? You want to go on strike? I'm going to lock the doors. I'm going to keep you from working, and I'm going to eventually you're not going to be able to put food on the table. You're going to beg to come back to work. And lockouts were pretty effective. Okay. Now, so one of the things that you'll see to combat a lockout, and this is brilliant by the unions move, is they developed these cooperatives where the unions would take their union member dues and then buy a local grocery store that'd be kind of owned and run by the union. So that way, if they went on strike, when the business owner did a lockout on them, they could still distribute food to the members of the strike. So that way they could withstand the strike, and then the business owner ends up losing. At least that's the goal. Okay. All right. So the first national labor union in American history is called the National Labor Union. Super easy to remember. It doesn't last that long, and they were discriminatory. There was labor unions well before this, before the Civil War, but they were usually within a trade and regional. This is national, and it included a variety of occupations. Now, the Lights of Labor started out as one of the most successful labor unions in American history. It had large numbers. Started out as garment workers in Philadelphia, and then by 1878, it emerged as a national movement. They set up factories and shops that would be owned and run by the employees. At least that was their goal. They never actually achieved that, but they did achieve some cooperatives, and American society would be, they thought, transformed into a cooperative commonwealth. They focused on education and were led by a guy named Terence Powderly. You might want to star his name. They campaigned for an 8-hour day, and in some places succeeded. They did win a few strikes, including a major victory against Jay Gould's Southwestern Railway System in 1885. And they had as many as 100 to 700,000 members until the Haymarket Square bombing, and that devastated them. Now, I'm also going to cover the American Federation of Labor in just a minute. That one's still around today. The AFL-CIO is the largest labor unit in the United States today. And we're going to I'm going to clarify why the Knights of Labor was not successful and the American Federation of Labor was successful and still around today. All right, so the Haymarket Square bombing. So there is three main labor strikes, really four, that you really want to know during the Gild Age. The Great Railroad Strike of 1877, the Haymarket Square bombing, because it started by a labor strike, the Pullman Palace Car Strike, and the Homestead Strike. Those four you certainly need to know, okay? So what happened at Cyrus McCormick's Reaper Works in Chicago, there ended up being a labor strike there. And so in Chicago, there was this big Haymarket Square, which was like a common ground, like a park or whatever. And people began to march and protest there. The problem is, at this time, coming from particularly Southern Eastern Europe, one of the reasons why Americans didn't like Southern Eastern Europeans, you began having these group. Now, majority of Southern Eastern Europeans were not anarchists, but there were growing numbers of anarchists in Europe. And basically, they didn't like the government. They wanted to really get rid of government through violence. They were early terrorists. Okay, the anarchists were terrorists at that time, and so anarchists not affiliated with the labor union set off some bombs at the Haymarket Square, and it killed some police officers. The police officers obviously thought they were under attack, fired back into the crowd. Okay, so really the law enforcement officers in this situation were just there to make sure the protests remained peaceful. They were doing what they were supposed to do. The labor union was peaceful. They were there protesting, but the problem is you have these terrorist anarchists who come in and set up a bomb. And so one of the things is you had some anarchists that get arrested. Now, were all of them guilty? It's hard to know, but the evidence was not great. But because the ones that do get arrested get arrested because they were known anarchists in the group. 4 executed, and 1 committed suicide in jail by putting a stick of dynamite in his mouth and light it. Let that sink in for a second. The others received long prison sentences and so forth. But the problem is the Knights of Labor had nothing to do with this. This is an anarchist movement, but because violence occurred at a Knights of Labor rally, Americans think the Knights of Labor are affiliated with anarchism. They're violent. We shouldn't join them. And so their membership plummeted, and they're done within a year. Okay, and so forth. I'll show you the picture here. This is a painting or drawing of the Haymarket Square bombing. And the guy in the middle is who committed suicide. So you look at the union membership, it peaked, and then in 1885, 1886, Haymarket Square bombing happens, and they decline and eventually fade out in American history. Now, the American Federation of Labor, lower membership, but stay more consistent. All right, and here's why: the Knights of Labor included skilled and unskilled. The American Federation of Labor, until later when they joined forces with the CIO, they included only skilled laborers. So skilled laborers always had greater rights in terms of negotiating their wages because you couldn't just hire any old average Joe to come in there and do their job. And so they focus on skilled laborers and they were able to negotiate much better. Okay, now trade unions developed to organize everyone in a particular trade. They also advocated the closed shop, which reserved all jobs for union members. That kept out lower wage and incompetent workers. So the American Federation of Labor would have favored that because they didn't want these unskilled jobs coming in. Trade unionism defended the craft workers' traditional skills and rights, and because operating chains was a high-risk occupation, the railroad brotherhoods provided accidental and death benefits and encouraged members to assist one another. So they created the first on-the-job accidental insurance. On and off the job, the unions played a big part in the lives of craft workers as expanding markets intruded, breaking down their ability to control local conditions. Union forms national organizations, beginning with the International Typographical Union in 1852. And by the 1870s, molders, ironworkers, bricklayers, and about 30 other trades had done likewise. Trade union members were also members of the Knights of Labor, so they could join two different labor unions. Trade unions typically did not allow women, as well as the Knights of Labor, until about 1881. Eventually, the Knights of Labor does add women, and that's why they're one of the reasons why their membership shot up in the 1880s. Okay. By 1886, about 50,000 women belonged to the Knights of Labor. All right, let's cover the Homestead Strike. Okay. Now, Carnegie owned a bunch of steel mills. One of them that he did not build, but bought from another steel, was in Homestead, which is outside of Pittsburgh. And they had a union already established because Carnegie tried to prevent unions, so he really couldn't really do anything about the union originally. So wages were kept low, and labor unions decided they were going to go on strike. And what happens is management basically locked out workers while Carnegie went over to Scotland. And then, so what happens is the strikers shut down things, and they stormed the factory, and they had weapons and so forth. So the second in command of the Homestead steel mill was a guy named Henry Frick. Okay. Now Carnegie went off to Scotland because he kind of didn't want to deal with this difficult issue. He knew Henry Frick kind of had the backbone to deal with it, and he just told him to do whatever he needed to do to break this strike and break this union. So Frick hired the Pinkerton Security Agency, which was kind of like a private detective agency, but also could be higher security. And they came down from Chicago, down outside Pittsburgh, and the workers fired on the Pinkerton agents and shot and wounded some of them. And then they fired back and so forth, and drove the Pinkertons away. Now, because it ended up in violence, the governor of Pennsylvania decided, we can't have this. And he called in the National Guard of Pennsylvania. And they eventually, when the Guard shows up, the strikers know that they've lost. And what happens is the labor movement's leaders don't get hired back. And then those that do come back can't be a part of a union. And so it breaks the union. There is violence. And it's one of the most well-known strikes in American history. It did catch national attention. And because there was violence, it turned a lot of Americans away from the Amalgamated Steelworkers Union. There was no labor union after that in the steel industry until the 1920s. Now there's, of course, labor unions in the steel industry. And because of this, along with the Johnstown flood, Carnegie spent after he sold his steel mill to J.P. Morgan's investment bank, and they created U.S. Steel, he spent the rest of his life involved in philanthropy to try to repair his image. The Johnstown flood I'll cover in a different lecture. Now, let's look at the Pullman Palace Car strike, because this is the fourth of the big labor strikes in American history. It started with the American Railway Union. Okay. Now, It actually happened because of the Panic of 1893. Okay, and I covered that more later, but the Panic of 1893 was the Great Depression for the 1800s. That was terrible. Even though it doesn't last near as long, it only lasts 4 years. Those 4 years sucked. And so the Pullman Palace Car Company made the first class rail cars for train companies across the country. And the American Railway Union formed in the 1870s. What happens, Pullman's Palace Car Company, because of the Panic of 1893, okay, so to try to keep from laying people off, they cut their wages in half. The problem is the apartments that the workers lived in were owned primarily by the Pullman Palace Car Company. So the workers were like, well, if you're going to cut our wages in half, then cut our rent in half. And they kept the rent the same. So they're like, you know what, screw that. They went on strike. Okay. A leader is a guy named Eugene Debs. Remember him throughout American history. He becomes a leader of the American Socialist Party. He wasn't a socialist yet, but he becomes one after he gets thrown in prison in this strike. So they began, American Railway Union begins having strikes in railroad companies across, or against railroad hubs across the country. They knocked over the train cars and violence ended up happening. And so the president at the time, Grover Cleveland, calls in troops because one of the main reasons, just like what Rutherford B. Hayes sent in troops for, is they disrupted the U.S. mail service. So history does repeat itself. You can't disrupt the U.S. mail service. That's a federal offense. And so therefore the federal government has to get involved constitutionally. So you don't want to do that. And they do that. And instead of the federal government siding with them, they end up kind of going against the Pullman Palace Car Company. The leaders get arrested and they get thrown in jail for a time. And that's where Eugene Debs starts reading about socialism. So you can see where different labor strikes take place. These are a lot more strike activity later in the map as well. Now, last thing we're going to talk about is Western radicalism. During the 1890s, mining was turned into corporate mining. The Western Federation of Miners was the largest mining union in the West. These corporations wanted to get rid of the union. As silver and copper prices began to fall, wages were cut that led to strikes. In 1892, striking miners at Coeur d'Alene, a silver mining district in northern Idaho, engaged in gun battles with company guards and sent a cart of explosive powder into the Frisco mine to blow up the owner. That's crazy. That's used in like terrorism. Martial law was declared. The strikers were imprisoned and put in stockades, and the strike was broken. Their president, Ed Boyce and Bill Haywood, joined with the socialists in 1905 to form the very radical and left-wing industrial workers of the world. We're called the Wobblies because they were unstable, but the Wobblies is probably one of the most violent labor unions in American history, and they typically use kind of violence and explosives and more terrorist activities. They wanted a new society that would run directly by unions, and neither the Wobblies nor socialists gained enough members to influence to seize national power. Now, the result from 1881 to 1900, labor unions held about 23,000 strikes that involved 6,610,000 employees and cost employers and employees about $450 million total. Labor unions still only embraced about 3% of the workforce, and it would be a few more decades before they were achieved equality. And by 1900, American attitudes toward labor began to change as the public came to recognize the right of workers to bargain collectively and strike. So things are going to get better for labor unions. It's going to be a process. We'll cover that later in this course. Nevertheless, though, the vast majority of employers continue to fight organized labor. Okay? So it's kind of a recap of why employers did not like labor unions. Okay, they oftentimes associated with radicalism, some rightfully, some not. Most of the time it wasn't, they weren't radicals. And so eventually things are going to get better for the labor union. We'll stop there.